So good morning and welcome to the second day of the Gatekeepers of Governance. Welcome to our plenary session, Is Compliance Good Business? Well, there has often been a complaint that compliance stands in the way of doing business. This is more so in case of startups and smaller companies that prioritize growth over governance. Should timely compliance not translate to good business? Well, our panelists for the session are, please welcome Mr. Ananth Narayan ji, who is a whole-time member of SEBI since October 2022. He has more than 25 years of experience in academia governance and international banking and has held various senior positions in India and abroad. Prior to his present assignment, he also held the position of Associate Professor in SP Jain Institute of Management and Research. He was Managing Director and also Regional Head of Financial Markets, ASEAN and South Asia at Standard Chartered Bank. Earlier, he was with Deutsche Bank as its Managing Director, Global Rates, South Asia. Prior thereto, he was with Citigroup as Director, Financial Markets, South Asia. He has also been a member of various advisory committees constituted by SEBI and RBI. Please once again welcome Mr. Ananth Narayan ji. Next on the panel, we have Mr. Ashishkumar Chauhan, who is presently the Managing Director and CEO of National Stock Exchange, which he helped to form and where he worked from 1992 to 2000. Prior to becoming the Managing Director and CEO of NSE in 2022, he served as the Managing Director and CEO of BSE from 2009 to 2022. He is known as the father of modern financial derivatives in India. He also created several path-breaking frameworks, including the Nifty Index, NSE certifications in financial markets, etc. He is on the SEBI Committee for Corporate Governance and an advisor to the Asia Pacific Investment Council and the Central Board of Direct Taxes. He was also involved in conceptualization of the National Securities Clearing Corporation, NSCL, and the initial setup of the National Securities Depositories Limited, NSDL. He is a member of the University Grants Commission and the Chancellor of University of Allahabad. Please welcome Mr. Ashishkumar Chauhan. Our third panelist would be Mr. Damodaran, and he is also the moderator for the session. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, friends. It's the commencement of day 2. We've seen that the recent 5-day test matches have all ended in 2 days. So this was never intended to be a 5-day test match. We had intended only a 2-day test match, but these days also, since turning wickets are prepared, on the second day itself you get a lot of balls turning the wrong way, which even the bowlers don't know which way the ball is going to turn, right? So that's the context in which we are meeting today. Interesting questions. I have 2 great panelists here. The only thing that hasn't been mentioned about my very dear friend, Mr. Ashish Chauhan, is, which is not in the write-up, is that he held briefly a job that I much coveted, which was he managed a cricket team. Right? So I did ask the owner's husband whether I could have a shot at that job, but he didn't think me good enough for that. I think you needed somebody who ran exchanges to, to manage a cricket side. Okay. So our question today is a very simple, short question. Is compliance good business? You can't get many questions shorter than that. The answers will clearly be complicated. They will be lengthy. They will be representing different shades of opinion. So without further ado, let me start by asking Mr. Ananth Narayan, is compliance good business?
First of all, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Mr. Damodaran, for inviting me over. And congratulations to you I understand this is the 9th edition of this event.
Yeah.
We do need, annual events like this to constantly remind ourselves on issues of governance. And, congratulations on all the great stuff that you're doing on furthering the cause of governance in India. The question you asked is short. And I think for most part, even the answer will be fairly short. The cynics will say that even the most corrupt person will never say that it's okay to be non-compliant. It's almost like a rhetorical question in many ways, that of course compliance has to be number one. It's after all a matter of trust, and the only way you gain trust over a long period of time is by being compliant. The old African proverb, if you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together, can be transliterated into compliance as well. If you want to go far, you have to be compliant. So I think there can be no doubt that the question itself is redundant because compliance is paramount for long-term trust and therefore long-term growth in whatever it is that you're doing. I think what can make this discussion more interesting is while we all espouse that cause, that we are all compliant, that we have to be compliant, compliance is paramount, what are the dilemmas or the issues that come up in front of us in practical circumstances? And there are two types of issues that I can see. One is an excuse not to be compliant or fully compliant. There'll be a whole set of circumstances where we can think of this. And the second one, which we don't talk about often enough, is where the regulations themselves are questionable. And maybe therefore the measure of compliance is not being perfect. So what do you do if the regulations themselves, you believe, are not correct? So both these scenarios, where one, you are justifying non-compliance, and the other, where you believe the regulation itself is wrong, I think it makes sense to go into a bit of that. And through the course of the discussion, maybe we can take up some of these specific instances.
I want to take up what you said last, and I'll pose this to Ashish Bhai straight away. Supposing a regulation doesn't make sense, it ought not to have been written in the first place. And as he said just now, it raises the question, do I need to comply? You have no choice. It's a regulation, you need to comply. And yet you know that this doesn't make sense, it's not good for business, it's not good even for the regulated universe. What then should a company be doing?
It's a daily dilemma for everyone because in a way, as I think Ananth rightly said, you have to go along. And if you are not part of the society, what is compliance, right? Compliance to something. Compliance to law, compliance to unwritten law, which are called norms, or some sort of mores, or the moral principles. And the moral principles also are what I call space-time framework oriented. That is, the same moral principles today we apply may not have been applicable in, say, Mahabharat time, for example, because the moralities also change with time. And so that's why you need to be a space-time sort of appropriate. And as you rightly said, ultimately whether you accept or whether you agree with something or not, if you want to be part of that society, because in a way you get your business, your money, your prestige, your future growth out of the same pond, as I call it. All of us drink out of the same pond. So if any one of us dirties the pond, then all of us will fall ill in different ways, right? And that's why it's a very interesting concept. And the way I look at, to extend your question is, what he mentioned was de facto versus de jure part of it. That is, and for me, the other thing that works is the later and spirit. That whether you go and follow the letter or you go and follow the spirit. And sometimes the letter and spirit are also opposing. That's what you said, that it's not helping the cause of the compliance or regulation. And that's where, for me, the modern methodologies which India has adopted, especially in Mumbai regulatory circles, that is finance, is that we tend to think that nobody believes in spirit nowadays because it's a modern world. So we want to bring down the spirit into the letter. So we keep on going down and down and down into writing more and more letters. And that's where basically more sort of dichotomies come up, because spirit is more larger framework. And when we go into writing letters, then we also create contradictions. And then to sort of subvert that, we need to write some more letters and stuff like that. So it's a more philosophical question, but the modern world also imposes you to do the tick boxing. Because like kickboxing, in tick boxing also, if you don't do, you're obviously non-compliant. And that is basically not possible now, because the automation and enter records, because earlier the files could have been burned, for example. Now the records are difficult to burn, right? Because they are in many places and they come out in different ways. So that's where now you can't not comply with the letter or the tick box part of it. The spirit is still live in some corners. Sometimes it comes up and hurts all of us or kind of haunts all of us, then we write more letters.
Interesting you mentioned letter and spirit of law and regulation, because the letter of law or regulation is compliance, the spirit is governance. If I see value in something, clearly I will do it. But if I have to do something because somebody who is in a position of authority wants me to do that, I do it grudgingly, because I have to, as you said, tick boxes. But that's not a value-based approach to what I am doing. So is there a business in doing that? Or am I just ticking boxes? Is it good for business that I am mindlessly ticking boxes that I don't believe in?
It's a great question, sir. I firmly believe it's the only business. It's not just great business, it's the only business. I think Ashish raised a fantastic point about letter and spirit of regulations, and the fact that, yes, we are very prescriptive in our regulations and we do go into a lot of detail about do this, don't do that. That part about the regulation and compliance, as you rightly called it, is like the post facto enforcement part, where we are trying to see if something has gone wrong. At the first line of defense, which is the business itself, and the second line, which is the board and the governance framework, frankly, we know what the spirit is, right? There is no doubt about what the spirit is and what is right and what is not right. That we come to the part about let's litigate this on the letter of the law at the last instance. Personally, I mentioned that there are some dilemmas or some excuses that allow us to maybe take a different call on compliance. One of the examples I've seen why and how it is justified that you be a little cute on your interpretations on the spirit versus the letter is, oh my God, this is important for our survival. I've also heard the argument that if we don't do this, not just us, the country will suffer. During this 2012, 13, 14, when the NPA problem started to grow, and pretty much everybody in the business knew that there were NPAs growing in the ecosystem, there was also a huge reluctance in admitting that there is a problem. And I've actually heard this argument, including from people whom I deeply respect for their governance, that, oh my God, if everybody was to recognize what the true state of NPAs is, this country will collapse. I have found that these arguments are extremely facetious, extremely perverse, First of all, the country is strong enough, it doesn't require you or me to do anything for it to survive. It will survive, irrespective of what we do. So this excuse that we give that somebody larger than me is at stake is, I think, complete rubbish. The second thing is, it is such a slippery slope, and we all saw the outcome of delaying recognition. What would have been a problem of 100 became a problem of 1,000 by the time it actually this AQR happened and people recognized what the actual losses were. So, by the way, the reason I mentioned letter and spirit in that case is, actually at that point of time, the recognition of NPA was being done as per the regulations specified by RBI,
Yes.
the letter of the regulations. Now, there is a deeper question that above all these laws on how to recognize NPAs, there is a larger law, which is that any financials you present have to be true and fair. If you know that you've got an asset which is definitely an NPA, and you're pretending it is absolutely fine, you are not presenting a true and fair picture of your financials. But you justify that saying, oh, I'm in compliance with RBI regulations. So the point is, I think at the level of management and governance, once you know what is right, I think that should be the lodestone, that should be your beacon to tell you what needs to be done. And the more you delay, recognition, it doesn't get better. It only gets worse.
Let me just give you a perspective. I went to Mahabharata in the earlier part, just to give this cuteness part of his interpretation. We all know Yudhishthir, right? I mean, he was the ultimate on truth. And his chariot used to run 6 inches above earth, right? And at certain moment in the fight against Dronacharya, the issue came that either we lose or we say Narova Kunjarova. That is, either it's elephant or man, right? In case of Aswasthama Hatahat. So it was said that Aswasthama Hatahat, and then Dronacharya asked Yudhishthir, saying, you are the only one who will tell me the truth, whether it is the elephant or man. And he said, Narova, I don't know. That moment is the moment of truth for corporate governance. The entire life, he was the Dharamraj. He was the idol of the duty. And that moment, because of his personal issue that he wanted to win, he just he did not say lie. And I can see a lot of lawyers, they train us or they train corporates into saying, but this is doable, right? And that is why I'm telling you that even those days, whatever, 5,000, 10,000 years back, whenever it happened, that was the issue. That is the issue now. That is it Narova, Kunjarova, that twilight zone, that line between the truth and untruth. You are standing and saying, I am somewhere in the middle because of the personal things. And there are people who know you on each side. There is no absolute truth in a situation. It's a relative truth. So, for example, there are so many things, I mean, I have seen, all of us have seen, that there is a group where you know that the son will take over from father as a CEO. And there are groups which say that we are professionals. And when the father brings the son as an assistant, there is a hue and cry. So that truth is a momentary truth for those people only, for that, because you have proclaimed for entire life about that way of corporate governance. Suddenly you come on that Narova Kunjarova side. That is where the society is able to see through that. If you say, I am on this side, they accept you, they discount, and then move on. When you say, no, I am on the other side, and when you behave slightly differently, within the letter, within the spirit, at least you think it is, that is where all these things happen. So it's a very, very nuanced situation in corporate governance. Of course, most of it now is later, the later part of it you tick box, but that spirit part of it is finally what you get measured on as a board, as an individual, especially as promoters. For me, in Indian capitalism, the way I look at it is, Indian capitalism is the capitalism of the promoters. In America or West, now capitalism has become capitalism of the managers. They put the manager in the front. They give him a lot of money, do whatever in the behind, but they pretend that manager is taking shots. In India, we have not reached there yet. We want to reach, but we still think that ours is a direct, promoter-driven situations, and that's why a promoter who is always in the eyes of the people, saying whenever, and there are two types of asymmetries in corporate governance I described, nowhere it is written in books. One is that asymmetry of information. You have more information as managers and promoter managers than anyone else. And the second, I call it asymmetry of power. That is, you have more powers than other people to influence decision. You can do related party transactions, you can do other things. And within that, a good promoter, whenever a choice comes, will always be on the side of minority and not on his side. For me, that is corporate governance. There is nothing else in terms of philosophy. That asymmetry of power and asymmetry of information, how the regulators are trying to minimize that to close to zero. They will never go to close to zero. But within whatever is remaining, how does the promoter or the board ensure that always they are on the side of the people without powers, without information, vis-a-vis people with power, with information? For me, that is the essence of corporate governance. And naturally, within that, people have to play. A good corporate governance, as you rightly said, may not get you good growth because they are both orthogonal. They are not connected. It may also get you good growth, but it may not get you good growth. But with corporate governance, on the same growth or same profitability, you will get higher valuation because people know that you are always going to be on the side of the people who do not have power or information.
Well, you mentioned Yudhishthir. I am tempted to say that if he had the benefit of advice from some of our modern advisors to the follow-up question that he had to respond to, he would have pretended that his hearing was bad and he would not have responded. So that was a choice that he did not exercise. Maybe he did not have advisors. But my larger question is that there are people that invest in companies. There are other stakeholders. They will all be exceedingly unhappy if they notice non-compliance, your name coming in some newspaper reports because you have not complied with something or the other. It doesn't give them great happiness. They are happy when the company is fulfilled all its responsibilities, met all its obligations under law and regulations. So do you think that by itself is a business case for compliance?
In a modern world, sir, compliance is costly, but non-compliance is not an option. It is a hygiene.
Right.
If you don't do it, you will be out of business sooner than you think. And for me, if you are habituated of non-compliance, the accidents, driving on wrong side every day, it's possible that you have survived for some time, but broadly speaking, in modern world with high speed, you will not survive, right? That is how I see it. There is no way. It's 30 years back, even 20 years back, you could have still overcome some of that, and provided you upgraded your skill set and your organization to become more compliant. But today, sir, you have to do it from day one.
Okay. I have a question for you. There are a number of cynics who say that good guys finish last. So the bad guys that cut corners, that take the shortcuts, and obviously all of that is giving short shrift to the legal and regulatory provisions. They are the guys that are seen to be doing better in the ecosystem. This is the perception, driven by cynicism, whatever, maybe powers of observation that I don't have, for example. So is it fair to say that In the kind of world we live in, good guys will finish last, the bad guys will get in front.
I'll extend the cynical point that you made, sir, to what I actually heard as an argument when I was growing up. So I was told that, and this is during a very intense debate that we were having. Take the case of Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil had a brutal history where Rockefeller personally, became a monopoly. He took over a lot of companies, a lot of the oil producing entities, became a monopoly, misused the monopoly. There was a beautiful book written in 1911 detailing all the stuff that Standard Oil was guilty of, including price gouging, price setting, all of it. Now, that was used as an example to show that in order to become what, and by the way, today Rockefeller is seen as a philanthropist and all of that. So the inference which was drawn is, in order to reach that stage, you have to start by cutting corners. I think this is a very simplistic, and by the way, it doesn't stop at Rockefeller. There are plenty of examples that people will give you of, look at this guy's past or this lady's past, and they actually had a very murky past. Now they are seen as second generation, third generation, much better, but in the beginning they were all, murky. I think this is extremely simplistic on a couple of counts. First, Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller went through hell as a result of all the stuff which was taken up against them and all the stuff in terms of reputational damage that they faced. That catharsis that they had to do to transition from being Standard Oil of yore to becoming, John D. Rockefeller was not easy. Take the recent cases. Boeing on its 737 MAX had, looks like, at least prima facie, it appears they cut corners on safety in order to catch up with competition on Airbus. Volkswagen, the Dieselgate scam.
I was about to mention Volkswagen's classic case.
So again, they actually went to the extent of, fudging the environmental results. And they justified it beautifully in their own heads. They said, we are working on getting environmental compliance. It is very onerous. The regulations are really tough. We will get there. We are simply managing the interregnum for a few days. The point is, when you cut corners, you pay a price. So you can see end point and say, oh my God, look, the transition has happened and now Boeing is hopefully going to be back into being a good company. Volkswagen will hopefully be seen as a good company again. But the hell they went through is really painful. And on the flip side, now as a regulator, I don't want to list out all the good companies. I don't want to put the commentator's curse on them and then something comes out tomorrow about them. But there are plenty of good companies that have stuck through doing the right thing. And today, as Ashish was saying, they will command a premium because when you hear that name, you associate good governance with them. You're willing to take a risk because you know they'll do the right thing. So I think this is very simplistic and facetious. The examples which are given ignore the realities they went through, ignore the pain they had to go through. And by the way, some of them failed. Enron failed. There was a huge, cutting of corners that they were doing, and they paid a very, very heavy price. It was the largest company in the turn of the century. We don't even know Enron today. So I completely agree with what Ashish is saying. I think there is no choice but to be in compliance. Governance is a necessity. It is not a sufficient condition. It is a necessary condition.
Yes, that's true.
You also have to have smarts. You also have to have good business sense to be able to succeed. Compliance alone will not help you succeed. But it is absolutely an essential condition. Now, just one last thing I want to add, particularly in our context of India as a growing country, with fire in the belly, young population wanting to deliver value, wanting to do great things. You will find frustration in regulations and saying, my God, it's stopping me from doing good businesses. But there is no shortage of opportunities that absolutely tick all the boxes. If you're going to spend all your time ruminating and worrying about the things you're not allowed to do by regulations which you think are kosher, you're missing out all those beautiful opportunities where you can absolutely tick the boxes and do the right thing and have that growth. So I think we're in a good space as far as being compliant is concerned. I'm going to go into a bit of a personal story for a second. I was lucky enough to be in banking markets between 1998 and 2017 when a lot of big changes happened in the financial markets ecosystem and currencies and interest rates and derivatives and so on and so forth. I remember one occasion where I was working in a foreign bank. The CEO of the foreign bank saw a headline in Economic Times saying wrong kind of trades happening led by foreign banks. He sent me an email saying, are we doing trades like this? A very blunt email at 7 o'clock in the morning, CCing my boss who was sitting in Singapore, saying, are we doing trades like this? Please confirm, Ananth. 7:02, I could respond to him, copying my boss, saying, so-and-so, whoever is my boss, I confirm to you that we do not trade these kind of trades. Let me go a step ahead. I confirm to you that knowingly, we do not breach the letter or spirit of any regulation in the country. And we were recording 30-40% compounded annual growth rate while staying in full compliance. We did not have to do the shady things. So in a growth country like ours, forget about morality, forget about bleeding heart, all of those things. There are plenty of economic opportunities where you can tick all the boxes, not be on the wrong side of compliance, and still register good growth.
Sir, I have a slightly different take. When we grew up, there was a belief that you will come into great riches only if you do something wrong. Right? So, and as far as we talk about the American stories, because they write books instantly, we write itihas after a few thousand years, so we don't talk about our own stories, otherwise people will feel bad. Whatever the case, basically, the capitalism as a concept required a lot of capital to create more capital. And India was perennially short of capital because we were subjugated for hundreds of years. And then when we became independent, we did not have capital at all. So only few people coming from traditional castes, who were sort of into industries, who had networks, who could raise capital, only could dream of becoming business people. And so that's why this entire concept of corporate governance, it was a kind of an esoteric subject. When we started working, a few companies started coming up with zero capital or very little capital, and they became very large. And literally they were in public eye every day with pretty much zero corporate governance issues, zero other issues, legal issues, other things. And that gave a confidence to this next generations and next generations and next generation. I think 3-4 generations have happened from 92 onwards. Liberalization started with that. The technology framework, now I call it capitalism with very little capital or capitalism without capital, where you put in little capital or no capital at all, lot of brains, lot of hard work, lot of exposure to the rest of the world, and you can create billion-dollar companies and personally become billionaires. And that is, for me, the methodology, because earlier you had to control, like Rockefeller, resources or land or regulations, right? These are the three ways you could manage. And it has been true for India too, even now true in many areas. But in many other areas, literally 90-95% of today's India and probably futures, next 30, 40, 50 years India, is about capitalism without capital, where you can grow literally on non-linear basis, that is lottery type. You put in 1 rupee and you may get 10 crore rupees or 20 crore, that kind of outcomes. We have seen with our own eyes without any great crime being committed by the promoters or even little crime being committed by promoters. And that's where for me, there is a great hope for all young Indians that you can still come into the money if you just use your brain, find the right opportunity. If you don't find that fast, pivot, move on, be compliant. There is no way, if you are non-compliant and you are very smart, you will be able to not create an accident. You will certainly create accident. So be compliant, but more than any time of history of the world, not only of India, today, youngsters have a greater chance to become successful commercially, that is, making great money out of nothing by using their brains and being compliant. That is how, for me, the future of India is in this capitalism without capital and with a lot of governance.
You mentioned startups. In the startup ecosystem, the belief is that growth is more important than governance, that valuations are more important than values. And this is not driven by the entrepreneur alone. Of course, he or she has fire in the belly. You want to see results as of yesterday, not as of tomorrow. But also by people with deep pockets who invest in such companies who want to see very rapid growth, and they have no patience for, setting systems in place, etc. We heard mentioned yesterday in another panel of companies that have grown big without having a regular CFO. A part-time CFO, and the company grew. So it was a construction built on sand. I imagine it had to collapse one day. And that kind of ecosystem, is it possible to sell the case that, look, if you are not compliant from day one, if you don't subscribe to the principles of governance from day one, you are not going to last. You may, like meteor, you might shine for a little while and then crash to the ground. Is that message getting across?
So I think it is, sir. For every case where there was incomplete attention given to compliance as a startup, I can also quote you startups and entities that started from scratch, like Ashish mentioned, which have since the time of inception said we will ensure full compliance in letter and spirit with all regulations. At least the ethos has been there. Some of those companies, by the way, which started in the 70s and 80s, which we know of, and I don't want to put the commentator's curse on them, and in the IT industry particularly, they have grown perfectly well. By and large, they are seen as good on governance. Even in our ecosystem, in the markets ecosystem, there are startups that have grown rapidly over the last 2 decades and done extremely well while ensuring that they stay on the right side of compliance and governance. So I think, look, you're right. When you're a startup, you might make mistakes. Because you come with a fresh idea, you have this burning desire to do things, you think this is a great idea, which eventually turns out to be the right idea, but you don't have experience, so you don't have the right people advising you, and you make mistakes. One is, of course, they could be honest mistakes. They were not intentional. They were things which you kind of happened to do the wrong way, then you correct and you move on. If they were intentional mistakes, you will pay a price. You might still recover, as many people do, but you will pay a heavy, heavy price for doing that recovery. So I think, as I said, especially in countries like ours, which are, I think, we will all agree in this room that our true economic potential is 8% plus real growth, absolutely possible. In a country like ours, and we are blessed to be in a situation like this, there are plenty of opportunities where compliance, need not be compromised at all, and we can still achieve double-digit growth. If you cut corners on compliance, there will be a price to pay. There's no doubt about it. I want to add a couple of other things which I've heard, including in startup kind of environments, but also in well-established companies. One example I've heard of why it's okay to go around compliance is everyone does this. And you'll be surprised the number of times I've heard this. On one of the boards I was before, when I was an academic and I was not a part of SEBI, a very innocuous proposal came to us asking for board approval to increase the size of a particular business because the earlier limits had been set by the board. Those of us who understood the business saw that the premise of the business was against regulations. The business, I don't want to get into the details because it will start, telling you who the company is, etc. But the entire business proposition was based on doing something which was specifically not allowed by regulations. And the board note did not say that. The board note simply said, allow us to go from here to here. So some of us who knew this asked the question, is this allowed? we heard a lot of English in the answer, the summary of which was it's not allowed. And then the defense came to us was, oh, but everybody does this. Not just us, public sector entities do this. One of the board members happened to come from the public sector. He said, yeah, my old organization was doing this. But here are a couple of things which I think were important in that particular case. One is, you're having this discussion as a board with all of the management listening to you, with a lot of officers listening to you, and you're supposed to set the tone at the top. If you go and give the impression that it's okay to, circumvent regulations or, be non-compliant because everybody else is doing it, it's a slippery slope. You don't know where it will lead to. And I think, again, my old point, while there was, I'm sure we caused a lot of angst in that company when we said, stop this business. It doesn't matter who's doing it. You can't be Amitabh Bachchan and say, "Pehle us aadmi ka sign leke aao, jisne mere haath mein likha hai, mera baap chor hai." You do all that later. So, I'm sure a lot of people were upset that that business was closed, but that company is doing well because there are plenty of other opportunities where you don't have to do things illegal. So I think the message to startups would be, and I completely agree with Ashish, I don't know why he said he disagreed with me. I think there is plenty of intellectual capital in this country to actually create good quality, and there are plenty of examples of this. I can name, again, being a regulator, I don't want to name good names, but there are plenty of names that will come to our minds on people who have grown the right way, have built sustainable businesses, and are absolutely great on governance. I think that's the model to follow.
Ashish?
Broadly, for me, if we don't write our stories, which we don't, we'll continue to learn from others, which are in a way look irrelevant. What Rockefeller did, later on, many of our currently good citizens have done over several years.
Currently good citizens, I like that expression. Right.
So,
yeah, okay.
And for me, we are all in degrees, right? I mean, in a framework that nobody is 100% compliant, nobody is 0% compliant. It's the shades of gray that determines. And other thing which you said that if you are non-compliant when you are small, probably you might survive. You will be allowed to survive. For me, today's world is very, very fast. If you drive on the wrong side and you are a new driver, you don't get a pass to have one more life like a video game. You are dead, right? So be very clear. If you start a business, be fully compliant. I have no doubt in my mind. Whoever tells you whatever, that other guys do it, as he said, other businesses do it, why would you want to do it if you can do it easily, right? And today's compliance literally is tick boxing. If you do all tick boxing, broadly speaking, you are compliant on everything, right? And that's where even the regulators today are hugely automated. They give you back the answers, whether SEBI, RBI, Ministry of Corporate Affairs. You get real audit trails on details, even exchanges, when you submitted things. So you have proofs of you're having complied things, right? And also submitted the compliance and all, which was not true earlier. You could do backdate and put in the files and stuff like that. Today, you get to do this. Idea is you need to be aware of all the compliances that are applicable to your organization which you sort of work at or you are the owner of. And that's where, for me, many of us have not been trained. We do not have good advisors or the employees who can help, like Mr. Damodaran said, organizations don't have CFO and they have become worth $20 billion and then they come down because not necessarily that the CFO would have helped if the management wanted to do any other way. But idea is how do you become more compliant, try to understand the philosophy, but also the practice and also the regulations that apply, because sometimes you think you are doing the best, but it may not be enough, right? And that's why whatever are the applicable rules, and there are now many, many, many regulations which apply to you, which were true earlier also, but nobody bothered. Now everyone does. And second thing, which is even more important, is that they change fast. Those regulations from municipality, Shops and Establishment Act onwards to the Companies Act, to SEBI regulations, everything applies to you. And so you need to be continually updated. Of course, nobody is a Superman. So you need to have advisors, you need to have employees who can keep track of that. But compliance as a business itself is a good business. People who help you comply has now become a large business across the world, because there is a book I read probably 10 years back, which has come out to be true. Most books don't come out to be true, but this book was like phenomenally true. It said that a bureaucracy will collect as much information about everyone as possible. And modern society, which is automated, will collect literally every second information about all businesses and all humans with them to control those. And it is actually becoming true that the modern bureaucracy, including us, both of us work for similar organizations. So everyone keeps on collecting millions and trillions of data points basically we call it regulation, but it's also control. And that's where basically life will be. So there is not going to be any reprieve. Many people think that if somehow this person goes, we will have an easy life, or that person goes. This is a collective of bureaucracy. All of us will keep on asking you for more and more data, and you'll have to keep on supplying, and please do that. Be aware that this is not going to go away.
Interesting you mentioned bureaucracy. I was just looking at both of you, and you said that you are a part of the bureaucratic system. I was delighted to remind myself that among the three of us, I'm the only non-bureaucrat at this point in time. Right? Okay, but that said, I have a question for you, which is, let's assume that humankind is generally good. They want to do well. And the business community is a subset of that. Right? So people want to do the right things. They want to do business. But they don't know what the law says. Firstly, the law is written in very complicated language. Interpretation issues are there. So I come to SEBI. And what do I get? I get informal guidance, right? And informal guidance which doesn't bind the person who gives guidance. Because it says, certainly doesn't bind the organization. It says this guidance is coming from that department and does not relate to some other department. And I know of cases where people have gone back and said, but we got this guidance saying you can do this, to be told, no, that came from some other department, not from us. So it doesn't bind to the organization. So are we making life difficult for the good guys? I want to comply, but you are not telling me, and you know, I've said this at a conference of lawyers once. Interestingly, it went well with the lawyers. I said, you are always telling me ignorance of law is no excuse. But your laws are written in such complicated fashion that I will remain ignorant. Help me understand the law by writing it simply. And if I don't understand, why do I have to pay top dollar and go to one of the lawyers in this room? SEBI should be able to tell me, yes, you can do this, you can't do this. Because I'm going to invest money in that.
I think you've raised an excellent point, sir. Now, I was a regulated entity for 24 years. I've been a regulator only for 2 years.
You're talking my language.
So
I said the same thing.
Talk your language.
I said the same thing yesterday.
I will, now all of this discussion that we've had assumes that the onus is on the business person and that their laws are somehow correct. But I said right in the beginning, that might not be the right assumption. As a regulator, I'll be the first to admit that sometimes we do make mistakes. Now, there are two types of mistakes, and some of you have heard me saying this before. There are two types of mistakes that we make as regulators. The first is the type 1 error, when we allow bad things to happen. So when Harshad Mehta happens, when Enron happens, when Ketan Parekh happens, something wrong happened, we failed. And that's the kind of failure that gets a lot of attention and focus. Regulators are petrified that we might allow a type 1 error to occur. Because then we'll be asked all sorts of questions, including what the hell were you doing? How did you allow this to happen? There is a second type of error which we don't talk about enough, where in our zeal to try and prevent type 1 errors, we come with a regulatory ecosystem which is so onerous that it comes in the way of good people doing business. That's the type 2 error, where our regulations come in the way of doing good business. Now, this is a dilemma that you put yourself in a regulator's shoes. This is a dilemma that you will go through. And by the way, it's asymmetric. Your penalty for getting type 1 errors is far higher than the penalty for getting type 2 errors. Now, this is where we need help. And we, meaning the entire ecosystem, needs to be able to speak to each other. How do you address this? How do you address the fact that some of our regulations are simply, illegible, we can't understand what they mean, what are we trying to do, or they're simply outright wrong? And I've faced this as a regulated entity where I've felt regulations are simply wrong. You obviously have to influence the regulations to the way you think it ought to be. Now, we try and do this through a process of consultation, right? So the way SEBI tries to tackle this, at a policy level, if you're making a change in the regulation, either for introducing something good or for stopping something bad, we first start with our advisory committees. We have plenty of advisory committees, including some set up by you, sir, where we take the proposition, we do some brainstorming, we put together an idea, then we put it for public consultation. We ask everybody, all stakeholders, to put in their comments. In recent times, we've been getting over 10,000 comments on certain proposals. So we go through all of them, and we are required to go through all of them, and then try and do some last-minute changes, and then come back to the advisory committee, and then take it to the board. We don't stop there. So that's the regulatory principle. That has to then translate into do's and don'ts for the regulated entity on the ground, beyond the regulatory principle. Even that, we now have something called the Industry Standards Forum, where we ask the industry that here is the regulatory principle, you tell us what are the do's and don'ts that you will do, such that it's easy for the good guys to comply with this. The bad guys will say they have complied, then we'll catch them and say you have not complied, and then do enforcement against them. Because we, sitting in our ivory towers in SEBI, do not know how things operate on the ground. We don't want to put the circular out saying these are the do's and don'ts. You tell us. Of course, in consultation with us. We are not abdicating our responsibility. This is the process we try and follow in theory, and actually in practice as well. Where we need help is more active participation from the industry at these two stages. Oftentimes the criticism that we get is at the time when all of this has happened and implementation is ongoing, and then people suddenly wake up and say, oh my God, what is this? For 9 months, for 1 year, we had consultations. We heard nothing that time, and suddenly we're getting all this feedback. The second thing that I would strongly urge, having been in industry, I think it's extremely important that industry has to be trusted advisors to the ecosystem, to regulators. When you walk into SEBI and tell us, do this and don't do that, you should be trusted by us. We should be able to trust you. Often the feedback that we hear, frankly, makes us lose trust. When we see something egregiously wrong, so for instance, let's take RPT. I think Ashish bhai mentioned RPT. There was a regulation saying you shall not do related party transactions without taking, approval of the majority of the minority, etc., etc. Now, what people were doing was you don't lend to a related party. You lend to a party who is ostensibly unrelated. That person in turn lends to a related party. So you've essentially put one person in between and then said, I'm in compliance because this person is not related. Now, we all understand that's against the spirit of what we're trying to do. But then when we hear arguments saying, oh, but this is as per the law. You tell me what have I violated. And then we start to wonder, what is it when you lobby for something, what is it that your agenda is? And that's when we start to become prescriptive, because we are trying to, fill all the holes and say, let's stop everything that could possibly go wrong, and then we deviate away from principle-based regulation to prescriptive regulation. This has to change. If there is something wrong happening in the ecosystem, please come and tell us. Let us not find out the hard way through enforcement or through press or somebody else. Once we know we can trust you, then we'll also listen to your advice on how regulations should look like going forward. It's an iterative process. I don't for a minute, admit that we've got this right. But I think it's extremely important that while we stay in compliance with the regulations, even if they're wrong regulations, you become trusted advisors to us and teach us as to how the regulations can be changed and should be changed in a manner that both type 1 and type 2 errors are minimized.
One last question before I throw it open to the audience. Are we serious about regulatory impact assessment, or we only talk about it?
To me, sir, or?
Ashish, you can take that, and then we'll let him have the final word. Yeah.
In a way, the regulatory impact assessment has several dimensions. Last week also, I mentioned in a public forum that all of us look at it only from our angle. The only participant in the ecosystem looking at the entire system is the regulator. So we may think it's going to impact us immensely vis-a-vis the benefits that may accrue to the society. But the rest of the ecosystem, we are not that worried about while thinking. Because all of us are designed for selfish purposes, even if you are very altruistic. There are only few examples of true altruism which we keep in mind as ideals. We don't reach them, that's why they are ideals. Like Buddha or Ram, or we in our society, these are people who we need to try to emulate. We can't emulate fully. Similarly, in this situation, that's where I said at 30,000 feet, at 10,000 feet on ground and below ground, 10,000 feet, the only person who has a job to think is the regulator. Everyone else is basically looking at it only from his angle. And truth is relative, basically that's where, for me, I would still think that there is a role to play for impact assessment, but ultimately, if there are situations which are affecting the larger society, irrespective of impact which it may have on a particular set of players, the regulator has a duty to ignore or to think differently and create new regulation. That's how I would put it.
Okay. I'm conscious of time. You want to have a quick
Very
last
quickly,
word,
sir,
and then
a straight answer to your question. In fact, we did raise this even at IOSCO, sir, on how is it that other jurisdictions actually measure regulatory impact assessment, how do they go about doing this. It's what we understood looking at various jurisdictions is it's a tough job. Okay, it's not a straightforward thing. We do have a regulatory impact assessment which our policy analysis department does, including with all our regulated entities. We don't go to corporates, but we otherwise go to all our regulated entities. We do have some numbers which, by the way, tend to vary a lot depending on who's providing those numbers to us. But I think the larger takeaway for me is there room to reduce both type 1 and type 2 errors in a more efficient manner? I think there absolutely is. And it's something which I heard my chairperson say to a bunch of FPIs who came to us and said, and this was a long time back, about a year back, and they said, listen, your regulations are tough, and they're probably right. She actually gave a good answer. She said, listen, you come to India because you see 8% growth, 9% growth. So you see the growth spurts of a teenager in India. You cannot expect to see an individual or an entity with the growth spurts of a teenager, which is attractive, and the regulatory sagacity of a 60-year-old. You're going to get both together. So we are in that growth phase where I think we have a lot to learn in how we can become a lot more efficient all around as an ecosystem. And in terms of actual regulatory impact assessment, we are we would love to hear ideas about how this could be done in a more objective manner and a more uniform manner across all participants.
The floor is open. Please. Now we are going to have problems. He heads the committee to reform the judiciary. Yeah. Okay.
So first of all, that was a fantastic session. Both your moderating and the insights from both the speakers. So I'm going to give you a little from a practitioner's point of view, since Ashish mentioned lawyers and how we try and skim things around, change things around. First of all, you may be pleasantly surprised. You said compliance is expensive, non-compliance is not an option. We've actually turned it around. We've said non-compliance is very expensive. Not only is it not an option. So I must tell you that's how we are looking at it, not any longer with this distinction. I want to come to what Mr. Narayan said. Everything you said, sir, about compliance, about following regulations, about being more compliant, totally agree with. I have one issue which is with the spirit. And I've been hearing this for my career from time of my being a chartered accountant to a lawyer. Spirit by its very nature is ethereal. You can't see it. It depends on who is in that position when the regulations were made or not made. I'll give you a classic example. And you also said that, the regulator has an obligation. We all know that overseas direct investment was made for Indian companies to expand their footprint outside India. For years, it was used by Indian corporates to create treasury operations and offshore Indian ownership, such that even a very large e-commerce company magically overnight became foreign-owned. No regulator did anything about it. Now you look at it from a practitioner's perspective. If I keep talking about the spirit, and everybody is doing it, not because it's compliant, non-compliant, everybody is doing it, and I don't do it, and we didn't do it. We shut out a lot of transactions. It becomes extremely difficult as a practitioner to advise. At the end of the day, we are in the advising business. And we can advise on the basis of looking at the law and a proposition which I think is easier for us to deal with, which is form versus substance. I think if you ask us, do we advise on the basis of form or substance, and its form, I agree with you, we are not doing our job. We should be advising on substance, but the spirit, when you add in, makes it extremely challenging for us. So either the regulator has to keep reiterating, redefining spirit so that we all know what spirit is, but don't hold us to spirit time and time again. That's what I would only request.
Thanks, Mr. Ajay. I think this kind of reiterates the point that I made, that we need to talk to each other rather than talk past each other. And frankly, when it comes to things like the spirit, but I have to tell you this, in my interview, when I was interviewed for a WTM job, I was asked this question: should regulations be spirit-based or prescriptive? I think it depends on it's rather than having a theoretical discussion, it's useful to go into actual specifics and then have a dialogue about what needs to be done. I'll give you an example which is topical on my mind, where lawyers are involved as well, in both good ways and not so good ways. Alternate investment funds, which I look after. They've got about 4.5 lakh crores of investments currently. What we've discovered over the last 2 years is that at least 1 lakh crore of those investments may have been structured to circumvent existing regulations of financial regulators. We saw cases of, for instance, funds being set up to circumvent NPA and restructuring guidelines of RBI. We saw funds being set up to circumvent FEMA NDI regulations. We saw funds being set up to circumvent IBBI, IBC regulations. And we actually accosted some of the fund managers, participants, the lawyers, the advisors around this. And it was a frustrating learning experience for me, because I did hear this answer. Tell me which regulation have I breached? And they were absolutely right. They were not breaching any of my SEBI regulations. And RBI would have had a tough time, or IBBI would have had a tough time, finding an actual breach. But we all know what's happening. Now, there could be the other side as well. As I said right at the beginning, there could be regulations which actually don't make sense, where we need to change them and make them more business friendly. I think the point is, while we've as SEBI have tried to have this regular dialogue with industry, with stakeholders, through advisory committees, through standards forum, through fora like this, we just need much more dialogue. We need to be trusted advisors to each other, and we need to talk to each other, listen to each other rather than talk past each other. And it's a journey. I don't think we're going to reach perfection overnight, but it's going to be a journey. And people like Sandeep will tell me on this letter versus spirit thing.
Get a mic there, please. I'll go to the back. I've been a backbencher, so my bias is there. After that, I'll come to you. Yeah. Can you get a mic, please? Just put up your hand so that the guy can identify you and get a mic. Yeah.
We can hear you, yeah.
Agencies, when, of course, thank you for taking all the feedback as industry as well. But what do you think about other agencies who are even more stringent than the compliance and, everything else that gets set up? So there are quasi-government agencies where when we are following whatever the regulation, spirit, law, everything else is, but then there come another set of agencies who are even more stringent than what you've asked for. As corporates, that makes it so much more difficult to not just follow the spirit, law, everything else, but again, take it to the next level altogether. How do you think about that? What do, where all do we follow what needs to get done?
I'll attempt a theoretical answer. Whatever are the higher standards, you comply with them. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's cost effective. But if there are two sets of prescriptions and you are doing business, comply with whichever is the higher standard. Go.
I can just add at a personal level, particularly in today's day and age of social media and everything being limited to YouTube shorts or Instagram, what do you call them? Posts or whatever. It's a tough job maintaining your reputation because nobody has time to go through the details. You can do a hit and run and kind of move on in life, right? I think the point that Mr. Damodaran made is absolutely right. What you have to do is to put your hand on your heart and say, I will hold myself to the highest standards possible, and time will be fair, right? It is a journey. You also have to have a bit of a thick skin when it comes to issues like this which come up periodically. I think if your conscience is clean on the letter and spirit issue, frankly, you can get through whatever you want.
Mr. Par. Yeah. First him and then you. Yeah.
First of all, I think it was
We are running out of time, so I want you to be brief. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
engaging, insightful discussion. What comes to my mind more from entrepreneurs' point of view, there is one set of governance, compliance, when there are established large businesses who are doing business for many decades with a good, clean record, and compliance, governance, at times, I find you will have a very conservative approach to protect your reputation. And in today's time, especially post-pandemic, when there is a lot of uncertainty, volatility in the marketplace, many a times good business is actually shown in poor light. I think what Mr. Damodar was saying, good may come last. Whereas at the same time, I see another business, new economy, startups. They are actually taking the approvals from SEBI for raising capital, what was raised. And they are not focusing on fundamentals. They are focusing on future potential. maybe the market share, and which are not direct financials. And the investor who is investing, they go by what? Obviously, it is approved by SEBI, so they believe. And many of these startups or the new economy companies, in the end, when there is a crash landing, actually it is the investor who is losing out of ignorance, and it's not a venture capital. So don't you see that these are two standards of governance, one for new economy, startups, second for established companies? This is a dilemma which I see.
So my fellow WTM, Mr. Bhatia, was here yesterday. He would have spoken about the small and medium enterprises, SME exchanges. Look, I think if you look at SEBI's mandate and the preamble of the SEBI Act, it talks about investor protection, market development, and market regulation. You put the three together, it's about capital formation. Our job is not just to be a regulator, it is to ensure that there is capital formation happening in the country. So I guess it's always a question of balance, of making sure there are issuers who are raising capital, who can create businesses and create jobs, create savings, and also investors who are willing to take on risk capital and therefore fund this virtuous cycle of creating businesses and then creating savings and then more investments and so on and so forth. Now, given that we need fresh capital formation, getting fresh companies to come in with as little, restraint as possible is useful, is important. But yes, we do watch very closely for, that this should not be misused in any manner such that investors start to lose out. So we have to have that balance. So yesterday, the speech that Mr. Bhatia made was exactly about this. Now we are noticing that particularly in the SME exchange, etc., that the pendulum is probably shifting towards, the investors losing out and fresh capital being raised by entities, not necessarily all of them are, doing the right things. So it's a question of getting the right balance. And again, the dialogue needs to happen about what do we need to do to calibrate and make sure the balance is right so that capital formation continues. And it's a dynamic process. We're not going to get anything, right at every point in time.
Somebody there, yes.
Sir.
We're just taking this question and you get enough opportunity, Sandeep. But the lady at the back, okay, right. Because we run out of time, yeah.
Sir, I am from industry and listing entity side. What I feel that during a stakeholder consultation process, the kind of suggestions being given, probably majority of us feel that being ignored or not heard of. I don't know, at your end probably maybe having enough attention. But somehow everybody's content is not being heard of. This is one. Second, probably one stage would come when for type 1, because most of the things at times we finalize hurriedly when type 1 happens. So when this maturity will come, when the type 1 would not drive or emotion would not drive to finalize the type 2.
So I hear where you're coming from on feedback. By the way, I mentioned this 10,000 responses that we got. That was for the FNO consultation. We got more than 10,000 responses. And by the way, we have to go through the responses. So because we are subject to a CBI, CVC, CAG, all of that, we have to make sure every single response is actually accounted for. The problem is you get a spectrum of responses, which is almost like a normal distribution. For every plus, there is a minus, and there's no real consensus around any particular issue. What I would strongly recommend to the industry, especially since you've come from the listed space, what is super useful is what comes from the associations. Right? So if you have FICCI, CII, etc., who collate from their members and tell us this is what our members collectively think. It will not be consensus, but it will not be 100% consensus, but it will be a large consensus. Similarly, I mentioned AIFs. By the way, we are working very hard to ensure that we don't, in our zeal to try and reduce type 1 errors, we don't increase type 2 errors for AIFs, because there are very, very good AIFs as well doing good capital formation. There we have associations, something like the IVCA, where we, obviously when something comes from the association, we assume that represents a the whole body of the AIS themselves, or in this case, the industry. Sometimes what gets tricky is that we listen to the associations, we follow what the associations tell us, and then you have 10% of the industry coming and saying, oh, sorry, we disagree with this. It would be great if you can get consensus amongst yourselves before you come to us.
Yes. That
You know?
of course. Okay. We'll just, in the interest of time, I think we'll get to the next question. Swati, I think you wanted to ask a question, and that this will be the last. The lady has the last word, yes. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Swati Kulkarni. Actually, my question is like industry and regulator consultative process. Regulator to regulator consultation, do you think that is also important? Because, we see often that in financial market players, there has been not a level playing field, and, that could probably lead to regulatory arbitrage for some players, and also it could help in good compliance. I just want to know your views on.
So very quickly, ma'am, my experience 2 years and a month or so in SEBI, I was actually pleasantly surprised to see the level of communication that happens amongst the regulators. So we all come under the FSDC
Yes.
subcommittee, sir. So personally, I was chairing one of the working groups of the FSDC subcommittee, where there is RBI, IRDA, PFRDA, NHP, all of us together. There's a fair amount of dialogue which happens on issues which intersect amongst the regulators. We also have, specifically between the RBI and between SEBI, we have a interregulatory technical group, which is headed by an ED from our side and ED from the RBI side, where a lot of good dialogue happens. Of course, we are careful not to tread on each other's toes. We don't delve into their regulation, they don't come into our regulation, but there's a lot of exchange of ideas, data, etc., which happens on a very, very regular, periodic, professional basis. So if there are specific issues where you think coordination is missing, very happy to take that feedback.
AI fund manager.
Oh, that's within SEBI.
Yeah, so that is one thing, and insurance and mutual fund. investment,
Intra-regulatory,
it's a different.
not.
that-
Okay.
that is what I.
Right. Thank you. I think we will have to stop taking questions. I notice a lot of hands are going up, and I'm a Democrat, but beyond a point, I cannot take liberties with what I'm told here on screen. From long ago, it's coming here, time up. So thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Thanks to my panelists for this year.
So thank you to all our panelists, Mr. Ananth, Narayan ji, Mr. Chauhan, and Mr. Damodaran ji for sharing the insights with us. And may I now request Mr. Damodaran to please present a memento to each panelist. On behalf of each panelist, Excellence Enablers is proud to have sponsored education for one girl child for 1 full year through the NGO Nanni Kali, a Mahindra initiative. It's a collaborative initiative between KC Mahindra Education Trust and the Nandi Foundation, dedicated to advancing the education of underprivileged girls in India. The project offers academic support, life skilling, training, and essential resources to girls from low-income families, enabling them to complete their schooling and in equipping them with skills including financial literacy and digital proficiency. Thank you, Mr. Damodaran ji, for doing the honors, and once again, thanks to all the panelists.